Good morning and welcome to this week's programme, an edition in which we mark the centenary of Frank Duff's founding of the Legion of Mary.
He must have been very like Francis of Assisi.
An innovation with worldwide consequences.
That I did tell them that they were destined to cover the whole world.
Who was Frank Duff?
He stripped himself and gave to the poor.
What were his motives?
And then to tackle the problem of prostitution in the city.
And what was his impact?
The red light area was cleaned up with a minimum of fuss and a maximum of good temper.
But as we are all aware, these weeks and months as 2021 moves to a close, many dates mark an important milestone in the decade of centenaries, a date which in 1921 could have marked a turning point in Irish history. But hidden among the key dates is one which fell last week, the 15th of November 1921, which was when an organisation founded some few weeks before as the Association of Our Lady of Mercy was renamed as the Legion of Mary. Finola Kennedy, biographer of Frank Duff, its founder.
There were other groups meeting in Myra House, which was then the house owned by the Vincent de Paul Society, including the groups included the Pioneers and various other groups. And on one occasion, a man called Matt Murray was recounting his visits to the old Dublin Union. And a group of women who were there, young girls, 18, 19, 20, were quite moved by this account. And they went to Frank Duff, who was present, and Father Torr, who was a curate in the parish in Francis Street, and said, why couldn't we do that?
And, of course, at the time, St. Vincent de Paul was restricted to men.
So a date was set for the following Wednesday, and that, as it transpired, became the first meeting of the Legion of Mary.
And in this archive recording, Frank Duff recalled that first meeting.
It is true that quickly enough I saw that we were dealing with something completely out of the ordinary.
Frank Duff was my oldest friend.
This is the public servant and historian, Lone O'Brien.
I knew him for the best part of my life. I saw him first over 50 years ago at the Carmelite Church, Whitefriars Street. We lived opposite, and morning after morning I used to see him riding up to the church door on an unusual kind of bicycle, locking it and hurrying into Mass. He was thin, sharp-featured, wore pince-nez glasses, and walked with an athlete's stride. Thereafter, I saw a good deal of him in the evenings, for he had joined the St. Vincent de Paul Society, and the conference to which he belonged met in the church building, where I spent a good deal of my time in one capacity or another. He had joined the society with some reluctance. His interests lay in athletics. He was a strong, long-distance swimmer and enjoyed a hard game of tennis. I remember that later on in life, when he had given up all these things, he found himself with an afternoon off in London. He had taken his mother, to whom he was so much devoted, on a holiday there, and she was taking a rest. "Do you know where I went?" he asked me. "I went down to the centre court at Wimbledon to see Suzanne Lenglen. It cost me 30 shillings, but it was worth it. She was wonderful."
And she was famous for showing a glimpse of her petticoat as she played tennis. How times have changed.
But one of his colleagues in the Irish Land Commission got round him and brought him into that conference in Whitefriars Street, which was the centre of a dense population of tenement folk, many of whom were living in real poverty. From the beginning, Frank gave his heart to the poor, and they gave him something in return. An understanding of how misery and suffering can be endured and turned to good account. Frank was always somewhat of a student, as well as being an original thinker. He had begun to read as widely in spiritual as he had done in profane literature. And I'm sure that at his morning mass and during the lunch hour which he spent in the Mary Reparatrice Chapel in Merrion Square, he pondered over and reshaped his Catholic faith so that it became for him his whole life and filled him with zeal for souls.
But the retreat for the girls was, this was the whole famous Monto episode.
Frank Duff's biographer, Finola Kennedy.
Where they came upon all these girls in the Monto, and they were the terrific brothels described in Ulysses, where they were on-street brothels, some of the most sophisticated in Europe.
Frank Duff recommended that they should go on a spiritual retreat.
A group of them, anyway, came and made this retreat. First of all, he couldn't find any convent who would take them because the nuns were scared. But this Reverend Mother out in Baldoyle decided to take a risk and accommodate them. But they had to bring out their own beds. They weren't allowed. Frank Duff had to get beds. They weren't allowed to use the convent furniture. I'm not saying it as a criticism of the nuns. They were just different times. So they brought out their beds. And after the retreat, and he had nowhere to go, and he went to see Mr. McCarran, who was secretary to the Department of Local Government, and W.T. Cosgrave at the time was Minister for Local Government. And they went to see him on the 15th of July 1922, and the following day, which was a Sunday, they went back to government buildings. I think because of a little bit of activity that was going on, the cabinet were living in government buildings.
This was because the Irish Civil War had just broken out.
And he was handed a letter giving him 76 Harcourt Street. And he took the girls to 76 Harcourt Street, and that was the start of that hostel, which lasted until the 1970s.
Nobody knew the problems of the poor better than he did.
Lone O'Brien again.
Certainly nobody in our time loved them more, or loved them in a more understanding and uncondescending way. He came of a different class from them, but he made himself one of them. He must have been very like Francis of Assisi, his namesake in ways. He stripped himself and gave to the poor, literally, for I don't believe Frank had a second suit, and he sacrificed a house on a pleasant suburban square to live among the poor and the outcasts. It's not easy for this generation to understand the Dublin of 1912. We were still emerging then. Ascendancy still reigned. The church was still a struggling church. The proselytizer was still abroad. And interestingly enough, it was the need to oppose proselytism that sparked off, as I see it, the movement that became the Legion of Mary.
He was very devoted to his own family, and of course his father became ill when he was a student at Blackrock College, so he never went to university, but he went into the Home Civil Service and did amazingly well in the exams and so on, and then supported his mother and his sisters, two of whom became medical doctors, and his brother John, who became Secretary of the Department of Justice, he volunteered for the Great War, and John was a great man for the Stephen's Green Club and the bar and the billiard room and all of that, but very devoted to his brother. But he made a decision, I think, at a quite early stage that he was going to commit himself to the single life.
Frank, with a formidable ex-guardsman called Joe Gabbett, who was a member of the Dress Confraternity at White First Street, determined to put out of business a breakfast centre at the rear of the church, which was being used by some sect or other to wean hungry, down-and-out men from their faith. They fed breakfast and prayers to them on Sunday mornings and kept them away from Mass. Frank found Gabbett picketing this place and joined him one Sunday morning. Together they walked up and down in the gutter saying the rosary and tackled the men one by one as they entered the building known locally as 6½. Then, backed by the local conference and the confraternity, they organised an alternative breakfast centre in a stable in Cheater's Lane off Redmond's Hill. I saw myself a good deal of this work at close quarters, with Frank in his element, cleaning up the stable and laying tables on the Saturday night, and on the Sunday morning early, boiling water and cutting and buttering large slices of loaf bread and shaving and washing the men. 6½ closed down. In the course of time, the Sunday morning activity in Cheater's Lane was transferred to Myra House in Francis Street, and with it a group of women who had come along to help with the preparation of the meals and the cleaning up. And it was this group who, on a memorable evening in September 1921, gathered with Frank Duff and a local curate around the statue of Our Lady the Mediatrix, for what in effect was the first meeting of the Legion of Mary, although that title was not assumed until an appreciable time afterwards.
Some of you were speaking to me the other day on that subject, and you suggested that occurred at the second meeting of the Legion. That was not so, but it occurred within 3 months of his birth that I did tell them that they were destined to cover the whole world.
And that proved prophetic. When he died in 1980, Cardinal Tommaso Fee said that perhaps the day may soon come when the Church will declare him Irishman of the Century.
Now, you ask me, what was I going by? I was going by the terribly evident spirit of what I saw in operation. But I said to myself, this is a remarkable, ordinary, simple people with whom you would not associate the idea of great accomplishment, showing a degree of spirit which seemed to be limitless.
But when he told them at that first meeting of the scale of his ambition, they broke down in laughter.
They thought it so funny that they must have consumed the best part of 5 minutes in uproarious laughter.
One must allow for his phenomenal human powers, his stamina.
Father Michael O'Carroll.
As I say, I met him 43 years ago for the first time, and I had the good fortune to be with him at a meeting of an interfaith group 3 nights before he died, well, the Tuesday of the week that he died. And his vitality and his verve and his characteristic ideas at that meeting belied entirely his age, and after he was 91 years and 5 months the day when he died. In addition, he had carried at certain times a tremendous workload, because his correspondence, which may well be unique in Irish history, went out all over the world, and it went out at something like a rate of 25 to 30,000 words a week.
Frank's early legionaries faced up to some unenviable tasks. They wanted to be as good as the brothers. He would show them. So he selected for them a number of works which typified his own unique audacity and disregard for the conventions. They were to visit the cancer wards of the Dublin Union, a most unpleasant but thoroughly rewarding experience, and then to tackle the problem of prostitution in the city. Frank knew a lot about prostitution, even at that stage. Later, it is doubtful if anybody knew more about it. During the First War, he used to visit the Catholic soldiers in the crowded barracks on the south side of the city. They weren't getting as much spiritual attention as they required, and Frank, once more with his old friend Gabbett, did what he could for them. When off duty, the soldiers were an easy mark for the ladies of the town, who came out of their dingy houses behind Marlborough Street at about the same time as the soldiers left the barracks, and were so numerous and so brazen that I have heard it said that they almost pushed the people off the footpaths. Behind them was a network of procurers, pimps and bullies, and nobody, as I said, knew the horrible ramifications of this system better than Frank. He knew well too the hot water he would get himself into himself if his plans to destroy the system failed, or if he only succeeded in spreading the evil. However, the fantastic story which he later told in Maria Legionis was one of complete success. The red light area was cleaned up with a minimum of fuss and a maximum of good temper. The girls were taken out and housed, some of them until the day they died, in a hostel, Sancta Maria, which Frank and his little band were able to start with the generous help of President W.T. Cosgrave and E.P. McCarran, the Secretary of the Department of Local Government. Other hostels followed, the Morning Star for down-and-out men, and the Regina Coeli, where unmarried mothers and their children were kept together. And these became prototypes in different parts of the world in due course.
It's often been said that Frank Duff was ahead of his time. His biographer, Finola Kennedy, makes that claim in her book, showing that Duff believed that mothers and their babies should not be separated.
When in 1930 he opened the Regina Coeli Hostel for women, the first person to present was a pregnant woman, a mother and her unborn child. And he welcomed her with open arms, and from that developed a unique system, I think, where mothers were encouraged to keep their babies, and they lived in units of 3 or 4, and one woman stayed at home, as it were, and acted as a kind of a mother to the others. and the other 3 would get jobs. Now, they weren't terrific jobs. They might have been domestics in the Richmond Hospital, which was nearby. But he was adamant that a woman should have the option to keep her child, and that was so far ahead of his time. And I've seen material in the diocesan archives where he wrote to the Archbishop complaining about a particular social worker, and the phrase he used was, "She is shoveling children into these orphanages," and he was trying to provide an alternative.
After a slow enough beginning, the Legion of Mary spread like wildfire, helped considerably by the envoys that were sent out from Ireland only in the first instance, but who later also came from other countries. Those envoys included frail beings like Adele Quinn, whose cause has been introduced. And to each and every one of them, Frank gave personal attention, guiding and encouraging them on their pioneering way in remote and difficult terrain. In the case of Adele Quinn, it is worth remembering now that Frank Duff, almost alone, was in favour of her going to Africa. Her quite extraordinary apostolate and the evidence of heroic holiness in her life silenced all criticism of that decision. In every direction of the Legion's missionary activity, there were successes to be recorded.
There were also more difficult missions, in China, for instance, where the name Frank Duff was denounced by the communist government.
He was the arch-imperialist, the capitalist-in-chief, wallowing in wealth, who was out to destroy a democratic people. The day that story reached me, Frank happened to come to lunch. He came on his push bike in the rain, and as he took off his old hat and well-worn raincoat, he looked anything but a figure of affluence. I twitted him, and ordinarily his response would have been to laugh out loud. This time he could barely manage a smile. He was feeling intensely, I believe, what his newly fledged Chinese Legion was going through.
Although Frank Duff might lack support in some quarters, where he might have expected it, it can also be said that he won widespread support for his work.
These were not confined by any means to those of his own faith.
Loan O'Brien.
He had many friends among Protestants, and for them and for the Jews he was instrumental in founding societies which anticipated the ecumenical dialogue of recent times. He also tried to do something for the writers and artists of 20 years ago, who are feeling frustrated because of the operations of a censorship for which they blamed the Church. This effort was not particularly successful, but it was interesting to see how Frank, with frustrations of his own to endure, how he managed to establish common ground with some of the outstanding literary men of the day. There are scores of men and women here in Dublin who, because they were in touch daily with Frank, can describe more adequately than I can his personal contribution to the Legion of Mary. It was immense. Of that there can be no doubt. He had imagination, first and foremost, and the stamp of that is on everything he touched. He had the unique gift of inspiring others. Courage, physical and moral, he had in abundance. He could be as gentle as a lamb, and this was his normal form, but in a situation that demanded sternness, he could be as stern as they make them, while his wrath could be terrible when things sacred to him were treated unjustly. He could coax a drunken woman in a crowded street to come away with him, or be seen publicly in conversation with a prostitute whose ways he wanted to reform. He often retired into a monastery with an alcoholic to help him to make a fresh start, and he could treat occasions like these as if they were perfectly ordinary. In fact, the abnormal was for him quite normal.
There are 2 very surprising facts about the Legion of Mary.
Father Michael O'Carroll again.
One is its amazing expansion through the Church in the first 4 decades of its existence. The other is the obscurity which all this time surrounded the founder. The expansion is shown in such facts as these. On the death of Pope John, the president of the Legion sent to Rome a message of sympathy on behalf of 10 million legionaries. The Legion works in 1,300 dioceses across the world, in every continent, race and nationality. The handbook is translated into 50 languages, the official prayer leaflet into several hundreds. Some 50 million copies of the leaflet have been distributed. These are aspects of the phenomenon. The man behind it was in life largely unknown, which is in my mind the second striking thing about the association.
Frank Duff was one of the very few who created a worldwide Catholic association in their lifetime, the only layman in the Church's entire history to do so. Frank Duff received no public honour in his own country. He was not invited to the council, though no other layman in the Church was at the time president of an association so large, so well-tried, so clearly his own work. When he went to Dayton University in the United States a few years ago to receive the Marion Award given by that institution, he passed unrecognised among a group of legionary priests who had come to Kennedy Airport to welcome him. He did receive a papal knighthood at the suggestion of the Archbishop of Dublin. The man's own modesty was partly the explanation of this strange fact. History will scarcely accept it entirely. Let us leave such problems to history, which he has now entered, as he has entered eternity, with such merit and the sure hope of such glory.
Frank Duff was born in 1889 and died in 1980, and the Legion of Mary held its first meeting just 100 years ago in Dublin, the anniversary being this past week. Finola Kennedy's book, Frank Duff, A Life, remains the standard biography.